someone had said, you know, that you're going to be spending 7 odd years thinking about how to keep a few donkeys alive, I would have laughed at the idea.
The wild donkey story started when donkeys were brought out to Australia as transport and beasts of burden.
Australia thought it had found the perfect desert helper in donkeys. After all, they were tough, cheap, and nearly unbreakable. But what began as a smart solution slowly turned into a national nightmare.
But donkeys are certainly one of the major problems in northern Australia. They can carry weeds, and they do have the tendency to change soil structure.
And once the damage was clear, it was already too late to turn back. This is the dark, shocking story of how donkeys reshaped Australia's desert and forced the country into a fight it never planned to wage.
When we first arrived at the property, my estimation was about 1,200 head of feral cattle and about 400 feral donkeys. And so then we did the destock, and after the destock things got worse, all of a sudden we had a fire problem.
The desperate decision that opened the door to disaster. The Australian interior was extremely difficult for people to enter and even harder to survive in. By the early 1800s, most settlers remained near the coast, not because they lacked interest, but because the inland conditions were well known to be dangerous. Those who looked inland saw long distances, extreme heat, and little visible water or vegetation. Many doubted that permanent travel or settlement was possible. Still, pressure pushed people forward. Settlers feared that other colonial powers might move inland first. Prospectors believed valuable resources were waiting to be found. Government officials and explorers believed expansion was necessary, even if it came at a high cost. That cost became clear very quickly. Expeditions moved inland with confidence, relying on maps and estimates that turned out to be deeply misleading. Distances were far greater than expected. Days of travel turned into weeks. Supplies ran out faster than planned. Heat caused exhaustion and illness. Water sources marked on maps were often dry or non-existent. Horses weakened rapidly, stumbling and collapsing in the sun. Oxen slowed until they could no longer pull wagons. Men watched animals fail one after another, knowing that without them, the journey would end. Camps were filled with anxiety as supplies dwindled and escape routes closed behind them. Settlements intended to grow could not be supplied regularly and were abandoned. Mining camps formed quickly during gold rushes and collapsed just as fast when water and food could not be sustained. Stations established for cattle and sheep often failed after a single season, when animals died from thirst or lack of feed. People did not give up easily. Many tried again, convinced the next attempt would succeed. But the same problems repeated themselves. Traditional work animals could not cope with the environment, and human endurance alone was not enough. Under these conditions, donkeys became essential. They were not chosen out of preference. They were chosen because they survived where other animals did not. Donkeys required far less water than horses and could go long periods without drinking. They ate dry, coarse vegetation that was useless to cattle and sheep. When settlers saw donkeys continue moving while horses collapsed, reactions ranged from surprise to relief. These animals carried water, tools, and supplies across areas that had defeated every previous attempt. In mining regions, donkeys transported equipment to sites that wagons could not reach. In isolated settlements, their arrival often determined whether people could stay or were forced to leave. Dependence on donkeys created constant tension. Settlers watched them closely, knowing everything depended on their ability to keep moving. If a donkey went down, fear spread quickly. If it kept going, hope followed. They were pushed hard because there was no backup. But over time, technology replaced them. Rails and roads improved. Trains, motor vehicles, and trucks became more common. Donkeys were no longer seen as necessary, but they were everywhere by then. Their numbers had grown steadily over the years as they were bred for work, traded between properties, and kept by the vast majority of the population. What had once been a practical necessity had expanded into a presence that could no longer be ignored. The station owners were the first to feel the pressure of this change. Without the need for the donkeys to supply the mines, the animals no longer justified the cost of keeping them. Feed became harder to obtain, and upkeep became an ongoing struggle with no clear end. The possibility of killing the animals was discussed, but never comfortably accepted. To carry it out would require time, resolve, and a willingness to witness the outcome. Most were unwilling to take on that burden themselves. As word of the station owners' thinking spread, it moved quickly through the wider population. Private owners listened and understood because they faced the same problem on their own land. They too were surrounded by animals whose numbers had grown beyond usefulness. The reasoning that followed was simple and persuasive. The surrounding desert was vast, harsh, and had always been described as endless. If the donkeys were released into it, the land itself would determine their fate. In this way, no individual would have to carry the responsibility or see the consequences directly. What followed was a coordinated effort rather than a series of isolated acts. Agreement formed through repetition and shared understanding. Gates were opened and fences were left unrepaired. Groups of animals were driven outward away from settlements and toward open country. The scale of the action softened its moral weight. Later estimates would suggest that the number of donkeys released into the desert during those years reached into the millions. With so many involved, responsibility became shared and therefore diminished. It was easier to believe that the desert could absorb the outcome and erase the act itself. But what had begun as a solution to survival quietly became a new and serious problem, one that few had anticipated and none had planned for. How the desert turned donkeys into an unstoppable force. The Australians thought the desert should have killed the donkeys. Any ordinary animal would have died quickly under the relentless sun, the endless heat, and the harsh, dry terrain. Water was scarce, food was almost non-existent, and the land offered no shelter. Horses would have collapsed, oxen would have died. Most humans struggled to last a single week. Yet human logic did not fully understand donkeys. These animals are built for survival in the harshest conditions. They drink far less water than horses. Donkeys can eat only shrubs, bark, and dry, coarse grasses that would starve other creatures. They can walk for miles and miles without slowing down. While cattle and horses need constant guidance, careful feeding, and water, donkeys do not wait for anyone's permission. They move when they want. They stop only when it is absolutely necessary. They have an inner strength and endurance that made them perfect for this land that crushed everything else. Once abandoned, the donkeys did not simply survive, they organized. Small groups joined together, forming herds. Those herds grew over time, spreading steadily across the continent. Nearly a decade after they were released into the desert, the donkeys had moved into Western Australia.
Now, to find out exactly how donkeys ended up in Australia,
The Kimberley, the Pilbara, and deep into the Northern Territory, nothing stopped them. Rocky ridges, steep gorges, thick scrub, and endless sand could not slow their relentless march. They climbed over jagged rocks, squeezed through dense undergrowth, and walked mile after mile as if the land belonged to them alone. Predators could not touch them in any meaningful way. Dingoes might catch a foal, a weak or young donkey, but adult donkeys were strong, aggressive, and capable of defending themselves. They were rarely hunted successfully, and there was no other natural enemy to control their numbers. Reproduction stayed steady and relentless. Every year, new donkeys were born. Every year, the population grew larger. Every year, the herds became stronger, bolder, and more widespread. By the early 1900s, sightings of wild donkeys were no longer unusual. People traveling inland reported seeing them crossing tracks in long, winding lines. Farmers noticed them crowding water holes, drinking the little water available. Rangers and explorers saw herds moving across the land, ignoring fences, property boundaries, and settlements. Unlike sheep or cattle, these animals were not controlled by humans. They moved freely. They multiplied freely. The donkeys were no longer merely surviving. They were taking over the land. And this was just the beginning of the destruction they were about to unleash on Australia. When the land started to collapse under 1 million hooves, the damage did not happen all at once. It did not arrive with a warning or an announcement. It crept in quietly, almost unnoticed at first, then grew steadily, building like a storm before finally exploding. The donkeys began by eating. They grazed on plants that other animals depended on, especially during the dry seasons when food was already scarce. Native species that had survived for thousands of years suddenly found themselves competing for less. Smaller, weaker animals were pushed aside and forced to starve or leave. At waterholes, the problem was worse. Donkeys gathered in huge numbers, trampling the fragile edges and fouling the water with droppings. Smaller animals avoided these areas entirely, unable to compete. Livestock, which farmers had carefully managed, struggled to reach water as the donkeys crowded every drinking point. Next, the soil began to suffer. Donkeys' hard hooves pressed down on the ground again and again. Air pockets in the soil, pockets that absorbed rain and kept the land alive, were crushed. Rainwater no longer soaked in. Instead, it ran off in sheets, leaving the ground dry and cracked. Droughts became even harsher. Areas that might have recovered slowly after tough seasons failed to do so. Some sections of the desert never bounced back. Around springs and wetlands, the destruction was brutal. Places that had remained stable for thousands of years began to collapse. Rare plants disappeared entirely. Fragile habitats shifted and changed, losing their shape and their balance. Scientists and naturalists began to notice the pattern. Entire ecosystems were being pushed toward permanent collapse. What had once been carefully balanced Living systems could not recover from the constant pressure of these wild animals. For landowners, the costs were immediate and relentless. Donkeys smashed fences in their search for water. They crowded tanks and troughs, breaking them under their weight. Repairs never stopped. Fences rebuilt one week were destroyed the next, and because the donkeys belonged to no one, no person could be held responsible. Disease became another hidden danger. Large, unmanaged herds moved across the desert unchecked. Parasites and illnesses spread silently from one herd to another. Horses, cattle, and even humans faced the risk of exposure, and there was no way to monitor or control it. The donkeys were everywhere, and they were impossible to manage. By 1949, the authorities in Western Australia were forced to take up the fight against this growing menace. Donkeys were officially declared a pest. That single word, simple and sharp, changed everything. Animals that had once been seen as lifesavers, creatures that had helped humans survive the harsh inland, were now labeled enemies of the land itself. And with that label came a terrifying question that no one wanted to face. How do you fight something that has already taken over half the battlefield? The First War, when control turned into a nightmare. The earliest strategy was simple removal, built on an assumption that quickly proved false. Rangers identified permanent water points on maps and treated them like chokeholds. In theory, donkeys in arid countries had limited options. They would come to drink, teams would wait nearby, animals would be removed efficiently, the population would shrink. At first, the numbers seemed to support the plan. Small groups were intercepted, some were shot, others were captured and held for transport. Daily tallies were filed, reports moved upward, showing progress. From a distance, it looked controlled. But the desert did not behave like the models predicted. Donkeys did not arrive in neat groups. Some came exhausted after days without water. Others arrived already agitated, sensing danger they did not understand. When gunfire erupted or animals were restrained, the rest scattered in panic. Many fled without drinking. Some ran until they collapsed elsewhere. Others disappeared into terrain the teams could not follow. Water points that had been reliable suddenly became sites of avoidance. The survivors did not return. Entire herds changed routes overnight. Animals began drinking at dusk or in darkness, or bypassing permanent water altogether in favor of temporary pools created by rare rainfall. The strategy pushed the problem outward instead of reducing it. Then the holding phase began to fail. Captured donkeys were sometimes kept longer than planned due to delayed transport or mechanical breakdowns. Shade structures were minimal. Water had to be rationed carefully. Heat pressed down relentlessly. Animals weakened quickly under confinement. Some refused to drink. Others grew frantic, injuring themselves against fencing not designed for prolonged containment. The rangers were not prepared for this scale of failure. They were trained for removal, not prolonged care and extreme isolation. Decisions had to be made fast, often with limited resources and no backup. Morale dropped. Teams began reporting that the work no longer felt like control, but damage containment after something had already gone wrong. Despite weeks of effort, surveys showed no meaningful decline. In some regions, numbers increased. What had been targeted removal had triggered dispersal, stress, and survival adaptation. The animals that lived through these encounters became harder to approach, harder to predict, and harder to manage. The strategy had not reduced the crisis. It had reshaped it into something more volatile, more scattered, and far more difficult to stop. And that was the moment Australia realized this was no longer a management problem. It was spiraling into something much worse. Trapping was introduced next. Large corrals were constructed near water and along travel routes. Gates were designed to close once enough animals entered. But the donkeys were not passive livestock. Some refused to enter entirely. Others broke through fencing, weakened by heat and sand. Traps left unattended for days became useless. Traps checked too often spooked entire herds away permanently. Then things began to go wrong. Captured animals could not always be removed quickly. Transport delays left donkeys confined for too long in extreme heat. Water supplies ran low. Shade was inadequate. Some animals collapsed before relocation could occur. Others injured themselves trying to escape, turning containment into a slow disaster instead of a solution. As failures mounted, pressure increased. Helicopters were introduced to locate and drive herds toward ground teams. But pilots quickly learned the terrain was not predictable. Animals were pushed into rocky gullies, steep embankments, and dense scrub. Some scattered in panic and disappeared entirely. Others were forced into areas with no immediate water, creating suffering that control teams had not planned for and could not easily correct. Operations were halted and restarted repeatedly due to funding cuts, weather, and political backlash. Each stop made the next attempt worse. Animals that survived early efforts became more wary. Herds fragmented into smaller groups that were harder to track and harder to manage. By the late stages of this first control phase, Australia faced a reality it did not want to acknowledge. The tools being used were creating suffering without achieving control. Some donkeys died where no one recorded them. Others survived broken systems and learned to avoid humans altogether, and the population kept growing. What began as management had become a chaotic cycle of pursuit, failure, and unintended harm. Australia soon realized that if it continued like this, the damage to the land, to the animals, and to public trust would only deepen. That realization forced a new, colder strategy: the Judas donkey, betrayal as a weapon. When brute force could not find the donkeys, humans turned to a darker, more cunning strategy. The idea was shocking in its simplicity. Capture a single donkey, fit it with a radio collar, release it back into the wild. That was all. It seemed almost too easy a solution for a problem that had swallowed entire landscapes. Yet the truth was terrifying. Donkeys are not solitary creatures. They search for companionship. They move through the desert in patterns shaped by instinct, driven by the need to find others like themselves. Once freed, the collared donkey became a guide through the emptiness. It would wander, seeking other donkeys. Wherever it stopped, others would gather, drawn to its presence. Each movement became a trail. The signals from the radios replaced months of blind searching. Hidden herds emerged one by one across vast distances. Areas that had seemed empty and lifeless suddenly came alive on radar screens. Teams that had once scoured the desert endlessly could now follow the movement of a single donkey and uncover entire groups that had evaded control for decades. The Judas donkey program transformed the war. Tested first in the Northern Territory and later expanded through the Kimberley in the 1980s, the method became the cornerstone of modern control efforts. The strategy was so effective that it was eventually adopted by other countries struggling with invasive species. It worked in ways brute force never could. Fleets of helicopters, endless hours of traps, and days of tracking could now be guided by one animal moving across the desert. For the first time, humans had a way to find what had been hiding for generations. But the cost was not just financial. The program demanded constant vigilance. Each collared donkey needed to be tracked. Each herd located required follow-up operations. The effort was relentless and exhausting. Ethical debates flared. To some, the strategy was a cold but practical solution to an overwhelming problem. But to others, it crossed an invisible line, turning the animals into unwilling tools in a human war. Eventually, public interest declined. Funding was reduced, work on the project slowed, and each time progress stalled, the donkeys came back. Their hooves would stir the ground, and herds would reappear. The donkeys persisted, and the challenge continued. Why victory never lasted and the fight never ended. By the early 2000s, managing the donkeys was no longer a short-term mission or a test of willpower. It had become a never-ending responsibility. Donkeys joined camels, feral horses, pigs, and cats on Australia's invasive species list. Government agencies, rangers, and conservationists worked in a cycle that never ended. Funding was always unstable. When donkey numbers appeared to drop, money would be redirected to other problems. But the moment attention shifted, the donkeys rebounded. Herds grew quietly in cliffs, scrub, and waterless deserts until they once again overran areas thought secure. Technology offered hope, though it was never a complete solution. GPS collars allowed teams to follow the movements of individual animals. Drones and satellite tracking helped map entire herds and their migration paths. Fertility control was tested as a more humane option, but delivering it across thousands of free-roaming, intelligent animals was nearly impossible. The scale of the task dwarfed every attempt. Even with the best tools, humans could only manage small victories. Public opinion added another layer of complexity. Some saw the donkeys as destructive pests, chewing through fragile ecosystems and consuming precious water. Others viewed them as living symbols of Australia's frontier history, a part of rural culture. Some small towns even celebrated the animals in festivals, honoring them for their endurance and resilience. Conservationists issued urgent warnings about the silent, ongoing ecological damage. Even scientists themselves admitted the truth, even if it was uncomfortable. The donkeys were not going anywhere. Decade after decade, the battle raged on, but then something unexpected emerged and complicated the story in ways no one had predicted. The strange twist that changed. How Australia saw the donkeys. In some of the most remote corners of the Australian desert, researchers began noticing something unexpected. During the harshest dry seasons, when the earth cracked under the relentless sun, the donkeys did something remarkable. They dug. Hooves scraped the hard, sun-baked soil, and their noses pushed deep into the ground, breaking through the crust to reach water buried just beneath the surface. These small, desperate efforts uncovered shallow wells of water that humans had not even known existed. The researchers called them donkey pits. At first, they were just holes dug out of survival instinct, but over time, these pits became something more. They turned into lifelines. Kangaroos came to drink. Emus returned. Birds gathered, drawn by the water and the new plant growth that followed. Even though the donkeys were still destructive, trampling soil and stripping vegetation, their digging had created tiny pockets of life in an otherwise brutal landscape. The desert, which had seemed so unyielding, began showing subtle signs of renewal. Humans realized that damage and benefit were not always easy to separate. Even invasive species could alter the land in ways no one had anticipated. This did not turn the donkeys into heroes. They were still the same relentless, destructive force that had consumed years of effort, money, and patience. But it complicated the story, forcing a radical shift in thinking. The desert was no longer just a battlefield. It was a living, unpredictable system. Every action taken by humans or animals set off consequences that rippled across the land in ways that were often unseen until months or years later. Today, Australia walks a careful, measured line. Controlling donkey numbers is still essential. Ecosystems remain fragile, and water sources must be protected. But management strategies now take a broader view. Scientists, conservationists, and policymakers must balance hard science, ethics, history, and the unforgiving reality of the desert. The approach is no longer about eradicating a problem, but about coexisting with it, managing its impact, and trying to anticipate the unintended consequences of every decision. Make sure to click the cards on the screen now for more interesting videos.